steering wheel. Lap's the steering wheel, yeah. Give him steering wheel. Hey, steering wheel. Somebody tell him to give it to him. Come on! Whoa!
Your leg, my please. Your leg.
How the f*** is this possible?
I'm driving like a grandma. Get that, Ralph? Did you hear me? Number radio. Ralph, acknowledge. Now, come on, close him down and kill him. We've got a lunatic on the track. Down that interstate.
Annoyed.
Hello and welcome back inside the Park for May. This is Todd. You know, motorsport has its legends, of course. We all know that. There are, legendary drivers, legendary team bosses, some who recently lose their jobs. There's legendary team personnel. I think of like engineers, very famous mechanics even. But it also has its legend in the governance of motorsport. I think of like the late Charlie Whiting, Sid Watkins, and even Max Mosley had a footprint on the sport. Well, if you ever have the honor of speaking to my guest today, you will be speaking to one such person, an absolute legend in motorsport. You see, if you're a motorsport fan, then my guest really doesn't require an introduction. But if you're new to motorsport, then you should know that Tim Mayer was born steeped in racing. He's never not known racing. He's been the SVP and EVP of Champ Car, the CEO of IMSA and ALMS here in the States. He's even been a steward and involved with the FIA in Formula One and World Endurance, WEC. He just got back from the WEC in Brazil. World Rallycross, World Rally, you name it. His CV would read like a relatively nice novella. He comes by it naturally, it must be said, and those of you who know Tim know that his father, Teddy, joined the Bruce McLaren in the very early days of the McLaren racing team and then took over that team and run it for many years successfully after Bruce's tragic passing. But suffice it to say that Tim could be arguably taking on the biggest challenge of his career by standing for the FIA presidential election in 5 months. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce and welcome Tim Mayer to the Park for May. Welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you, Todd. I don't actually recognize myself from that introduction. Listen, I've had an incredibly fortunate career. But when you say it like that, it's a little humbling because I've had a lot of help along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Tim, I want to jump into questions. Before we get into the question, I really want to, I'm going to circle on 3 things that I thought folks would like to hear about. Before I do that, let me just get the murky stuff out of the way up front. Not expecting you to have commentary, but you're welcome to. But I want to just get this out up front. Longtime listeners, apart from me, kind of knows our feelings about this. But up front, I've always felt that the current FIA president was perhaps kind of miscast for the role, if I'm honest. His actions and words to me leave me wondering the last 4 years if he was ever really qualified for this position. There's moments of self-reflection and consideration that I have and things that, that have been done with this administration that have me wondering to myself, wow, if he hasn't spent the last 4 years fighting off that feeling of imposter syndrome, maybe he should be. It's unfortunate to see the consolidation of power around his position, the changing of the FIA statutes and the process, insulating himself, the mass exodus, Tim, of very seasoned professionals that you personally know in senior positions, yourself included, it should be a real alarm bell from this administration. Also, just the clear, as a fan sitting at home watching on TV, post race in the Park for May, the podium interactions, you can even see this, that even F1 itself, when they're around, there's just clear body language from the drivers, the team, the pundits, even sponsors in F1 itself that you can just cut with a dull spoon. They're not big fans, and it's painfully obvious. So the stark difference between MBS's experience and skills and your ability, Tim, to build organizations, to grow organizations, to create member value, and to elevate motorsport governance really couldn't be more different, in my opinion. And I think, go ahead.
I don't want to do a disservice to the member clubs that elected Mohammed in the first place. Mohammed built an ASN, a sport club, in the Middle East. He genuinely ran that quite well. He genuinely built motorsports in his country. So when the member clubs looked at his qualifications versus at the time Graham Stoker, who was running against him, I don't think they made an unreasonable assumption that he could be the right person to move forward. It's just been, unfortunately, not panned out the way that I think most people thought of it. He did a roundtable at the RAC in London prior to the last election, and there were a lot of promises made. They all sounded extremely reasonable, well articulated. He had around him a very strong team of professionals. So the members made at what was at the time a logical choice. Mm-hmm. What's happened since, I think you've said it very well. The focus has not been on delivery, in my opinion. The focus has been on consolidation of power in an unprecedented way. I mean, the statutes of the FIA have been changed and changed and changed again. And every time it's just been a sort of short incremental change towards where we are today, which is, we're no longer talking about democracy, even though that's the platform that he ran on. We're no longer talking about real representation, because the people that are elected to represent can no longer even talk to their members they're supposed to represent. So this has just been a terrible erosion of governance standards in the FIA. I think also that the relationship that he has with, say, the drivers is just not the way a body like the FIA should be working. The relationship he has with the promoters and the teams is the same. We should not be treating all of these stakeholders, these people who have invested their time, their lives in some cases, their careers, as if they're naughty children. It's just not the way to do it. So, I really have come to the conclusion that this needs to change. And a lot of people have supported me on this journey. We're not there yet. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of work to do with the member clubs in showing them that there is a better way forward, which is why we've called the campaign FIA Forward, because we think we can do that. Excellent.
It's a perfect dovetail into my first questions that I wanted to ask you. It really broke these down. First, there's a lot of new fans to motorsport, and I just want to do, if you'll indulge me, Tim, I want to run through a little bit about the FIA. Feel free to jump in and correct me where I'm way off mark here. But for those that are newer to the sport, the FIA is the motorsport's global governing body. It has around 147 member organizations, roughly 140 and 150 countries. They manage both sport, like F1, WRC, and mobility, road safety, and sustainability programs. Their governance, the FIA is governed by the General Assembly. Now, these are the member clubs who constitute the voting body of the General Assembly. It also has a Senate, which has recently been gutted, but they typically had oversight of the ethics and financial element of the FIA. And then there was the World Councils, the World Motorsport Council, the World Mobility Councils, and those too have seriously been impacted by the current administration. The member clubs, there's 147 national motorsport mobility clubs. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
245.
245. Okay.
Yeah.
And these range from very large clubs like Motorsport UK all the way down, folks, to very small emerging market clubs, each of those with voting rights in the General Assembly. The revenue streams primarily, certainly F1's commercial rights, the sanction fees, licensing fees, the mobility-related programs. There's multiple revenue streams. But as we just talked, that certainly the challenges now that it faces through centralized decision-making, high staff turnover. I'm thinking, Tim, of like Natalie Robin, Robert Reed, yourself, lack of transparency, very strained relationship with stakeholders, drivers, promoters, those kind of things, teams, and I would argue even maybe F1. Have fueled a lot of criticism, and it led me, when I was really kind of researching this a little bit, it led me to sort of think that some of the smaller clubs probably feel marginalized, lacking resources or influence. The government is perceived as opaque. With the statutes limiting oversight by ethics and audit committees, those kind of things, and it really. There's one other element I kept thinking, and help me if I'm wrong on this, Tim, but I think F1's size and explosive size and its dominance can tend to overshadow other series or mobility initiatives, creating this sort of imbalance of resource allocation within the F1 or FIA. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
I think there's two things that I'd like to bring up from that. One is, one of the things that Mohammed has done well is to highlight that the smaller member clubs are incredibly important. There's what a lot of people think of as a strange voting system within the FIA, which is to say that, you've brought up Motorsport UK. The UK, the US, Germany, France, Italy, these are motorsport powerhouses. They've got, thousands of members, thousands of drivers, hundreds of team owners and that kind of thing. They have the same vote as a Caribbean island that has one karting track.
Right.
And a lot of people think that that's a bizarre situation. I actually, this is an area on which Mohammed and I agree. This is appropriate within the FIA because, for the same reason in the U.S., why we have 2 members of the Senate for Rhode Island and 2 members of the Senate for Texas.
Right.
Those smaller clubs need to have influence, and their influence is through, as you described it, the General Assembly, their ability to vote, and they need to feel that at least once a year, twice a year, they get to stand up and vote and say, look, this is what's going to be good for me as a small club where I don't otherwise have a lot of influence. Now, Motorsport UK is going to be able to take care of itself. The ADAC, which is the mobility club in Germany, is going to take care of itself. ACUS in the United States, which is the combination of the big member clubs, NASCAR, IndyCar, SECA, NHRA, USAC, and IMSA, got all 6. Those clubs are going to be able to take care of themselves. Those resources of the FIA, that focus and attention needs to go to those smaller clubs. So this voting system, which some feel is a little bizarre, given the relative size of, say, motorsports in the U.S. versus motorsports in Andorra, for instance, that's I think appropriate. And Mohammed has highlighted this. And he has given the illusion of providing a greater voice for these member clubs in underserved areas. Why do I say it's an illusion? Well, he has said you have a voice. He has said it and articulated it very well. But what does that really mean? Well, you don't see them really being able to affect change unless it's change that he's suggested. If they come up and they want to debate something, you're done. You're out. Because the democratic norms of debate, and criticism, which I happen to think are constructive and are the first step towards making better decisions, no longer exist. You mentioned the World Councils. They are elected, the members of the World Councils are elected by the member clubs to represent them in in mobility, which is, as you said, road safety and access and dignity and opportunity for road users, and sport. So there are two world councils. Mohammed has put in place a non-disclosure agreement. Now, non-disclosure for sensitive items, I get it. Contract terms, I get it. But they're not even allowed to discuss the agenda of the meetings with the people that they are supposed to represent. And unilaterally, the presidential team gets to fine you 50,000 euros if they don't even have to prove that you leaked it or talked about it or whatever. They can just institute a 50,000 euro fine.
Wow.
This is not normal democratic process.
No.
You mentioned the Senate. They have always had financial oversight. They've always had ethics oversight. Those have been gutted. And if Senate members who are supposed to supervise and oversee the president, if they are not on his side, or they say, hey, we should look at this, they can now be unilaterally pushed out by the president, and have been.
Yeah.
This has happened. So, this is not normal. It is not good for the smaller clubs. It's my job to explain this to them. And, my platform is to devolve power back to these clubs, to hand it back to them, and listen to them, and listen to criticism, and listen to, what they want for change. There have been steps, and I'm absolutely not going to take away from Mohammed, what he has done right, because there have been some things that he's done right. As was recently pointed out by one of the members for Africa, the first General Assembly ever held in Africa happened last year. This is a good step. These are not, I'm absolutely not going to deny that there are some things that he is doing correctly, but at the expense of normal democratic, normal representation, normal standards for behavior of any organization, let alone one that's supposed to represent people around the world.
Yeah, it seems, from the outside looking in, it seems a little specious about, inviting a participation, but then telling them how they're going to participate. Without that empowering of those smaller clubs, whether that's through resource allocation, regional development funds that might go into, even subsidizing some events in some of these smaller emerging markets to boost participation or visibility, those kind of things. I guess, Tim, how would you see in your platform, we've talked about empowering those smaller clubs to have that voice, to have that voting, to be part of and elect the world councils. How do you see your platform enhancing that member engagement? Is it voting reforms that need to happen for member clubs? Is it club recognition programs? How do you see enhancing that engagement?
Well, we're going to start rolling out our manifesto over the next month or so. And we're going to start with governance. We're going to move on to mobility, and then we're going to move on to sport. But the focus is on how do we deliver value for these member clubs, particularly the ones in underserved regions. This is critical. That's where real growth can happen. Right. Mohammed's talked about it. He talked in his manifesto about doubling worldwide motorsport.
Right.
We haven't even come close to that. And listen, I think an expectation of doubling motorsport in 4 years was aspirational at best.
Yeah.
But the growth of motorsport in these smaller countries is going to be driven by finding affordable, simple regulations that encourage motorsport. So, there's been a lot of debate right now over the last few years about karting, for instance.
Right.
Karting has become incredibly expensive, and the barrier to entry for people, whether it be cost or complexity of the regulations or it's been remarkable. They recently delivered actually at that event in Kigali, Rwanda last year. They delivered Crosscar. Now, Crosscar has been something that's been in the works since the last 4 years of Jean Todd's era. The original target price of a Crosscar was 9,000 euros. It now is 40,000 euros.
Wow.
And that's not grassroots motorsports anymore.
No.
That's not something that's affordable. And why is it? Because they added complexity to the regulations. They added cost to the vehicle. And I consider myself to be somebody who has been incredibly fortunate. But I have to think twice about a 40,000 euro Crosscar.
Right.
And if you're in Africa or Asia or Latin America, it's just out of sight.
Yeah.
So this is where we can affect change. Is we can absolutely go in and deregulate the complexity of the sport. I'll give you another example. I've been on the Circuits Commission as a circuit inspector for quite a long time. The process of getting a circuit homologated, which means licensed, basically, is expensive and it's complex. And there's a book that's an inch thick that tells you how you need to do that. For these entry level tracks that are desperately needed for the growth of motorsports anywhere, it is absolutely possible to deliver simplified regulations. And I've been talking about this with some of the members of the Circuits Commission. That is the kind of thing that we need to do. And these are small ideas that have a huge impact.
Yeah.
Because this is where we are failing as a motorsport community in terms of delivering accessible motorsport to all these countries around the world. Absolutely, the FIA needs to focus its resources on these countries. We need to have regional offices in each of the time zones. Geneva, right. Lovely place, but if you're trying to call from pick a country in Oceania, for instance, the only time you can catch them is at 2:00 in the morning your time.
Right.
There need to be regional delivery offices for the FIA. So these are the kinds of ideas that we have that come from 30 plus years of administering motorsport. We have to make it accessible. I'm going to go back to something you said though, which is about Formula One. Formula One, World Endurance Championship, Rallycross, Rally, you name it, any of the major championships. We need to work with these championships in the spirit of partnership. We've got to come to the table with the manufacturers, with the investors, with the drivers and the teams, and say, where are we going over the next 10 years? Recently, about a month ago, Mohammed suggested that we should go back to V10 engines.
Right.
Okay, we can have a conversation about V10 engines. He said for 2026. I mean, there is no scenario where flipping to a new engine formula for 2026 made any sense.
Right.
This last week, he's suggested V8s for 2029. 2029, 2028. Okay, maybe. Certainly, there's a conversation that can be had. But But manufacturers are not looking for the sanctioning body, for the worldwide governing body to be throwing out ideas for the next 3 years. The conversations that need to be had are, where are we going 10 years from now? Where are we as a sport? What's the development pathway? And then we can start saying, okay, well, let's fill in the pieces in between. But those kinds of throwing out in the media, as a trial balloon, V8s for 2029, do not promote trust of investors. Do not promote trust of engine manufacturers and OEMs. It's completely the opposite. So, I've been involved in the Endurance Commission for a long time, and the ACO, along with IMSA, along with, marginally with the FIA, have done an amazing job of articulating a long-term vision. Mm-hmm. And you've seen what's happened in the WEC. You've seen what's happened in IMSA, the explosion of manufacturer involvement in both of those championships. And how did it happen? It's just hard work. It's sitting down, articulating a vision. It's providing the resources for your people to come up with the details. It's Pierre Fillon, Jim France, together have engineered a revolution in sports car racing, and they've done it through this consultative process, this a spirit of partnership with the people that are going to come in and invest. That needs to be happening in World Rally. It needs to be happening on a long-term, decades-long process. That's the journey that the FIA needs to be doing. It's no different, by the way, than what we need to be doing with the member clubs in these other regions, in underserved regions. This is about partnership. It's about consultation. It's about respect, mutual respect. That's how you do business.
Yeah, these small clubs, too. It's one thing to be submit an application, create a club, and be a member. That's one thing. The value in membership, having a seat at the table, to having a voice, and those things are all beneficial. But the real value is creating an FIA that could actually increase and help increase those clubs' membership and their revenue through fees and sanction fees and hosting fees and those kind of things, and help them grow. The idea about the grassroots, all of the F1 teams have young driver programs, but maybe those grassroots efforts, you make the licensing it more affordable for karting and those kind of things, or maybe you look at pathways for training for officiating, or for officials, for marshals, for engineers. How can you find the next Rory Byrne out of Johannesburg, right? And so it seems like there's a lot of touch points of value you could offer to those small clubs. Because right now it seems like they had a seat at the table, but now the table's been pushed out in the hallway, Well, again, I don't want to I don't want to miss that Mohammed has done some things, sometimes more it's sort of for PR purposes than for anything else. Yeah.
And I'll tell you, the one area of the FIA right now that is humming along is the PR department that is celebrating small victories.
Right.
But there are really fantastic people working really hard at the FIA. My feeling is that they need to have a global vision articulated for them. They need to be provided with the resources to do their work, and they need to be nurtured. They need to be mentored. They need to be worked with. And I think that environment is sadly lacking. Look, I've had pushback recently on some comments I made, about women in positions of power being pushed out.
Yep.
And I accept that there have been some high-profile nominations, for instance, to the World Motorsport Council. Absolutely, no question about it. And I celebrate, those individuals who are, incredibly powerful voices for an experience that they have lived. But that being said, you've got to also look at the record of the Natalie Robins of the world, being recruited in and then pushed out. And you start to look at this in more detail. You kind of go, is this culture inside the building as healthy as they're talking about?
Right.
I got a letter recently that was from the head of the Women in Motorsports Council, and she made some good points. No question. That there are a large number of people that are working inside the building, and I don't want to diminish their work in any way, shape, or form. I don't want to diminish the fact that there are more women on the World Motorsport Council than there ever have been. No question. Mm-hmm. They're not the senior management of the federation. They are they're political appointees. Nothing wrong with that, and they absolutely contribute to the organization.
Right.
But this, what I have described is this illusion that Mohammed has created, and you see the number of high quality, top level managers that have come and gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a problem. It really is.
Yeah, some of that talent was incredibly seasoned professionals in their roles, and would have been a huge impact on the FIA. But they left for, well, you can read the reasons they left. Let me ask you about, because it seems like to me, you're right. And on the outside looking in, I can see this. In my world, we go in, we do a lot of go-to-market research and development, voice of customer research. We do a lot of, customer persona creation. The FIA could do that around all of its member clubs and really come up with a plan that brings back that member value. But one side of this is that it's all about revenue and revenue generation, and certainly the commercial partnerships with F1 sponsorship portfolio, targeting the technology and those kind of things. Tim, I know that Max sold, it to Bernie for 99 years. I know Liberty bought that. Is there a possibility in your mind of renegotiating terms with Liberty over the increase of the FIA share in the commercial rights value? Is that a conversation over a coffee with Stefano, or would that take a golf game with John, Malone, and Chase?
I think the answer to that is more complicated. I mean, Mohammed has promised the members that there's going to be he's going to engineer a massive change in the commercial relationship between Formula One and the FIA. It hasn't happened, and why would it? Yep. When you're acting, in my opinion, in bad faith as a partner, why would these major championships want to renegotiate when they sit in a position of advantage?
Yeah.
But I do think there is a conversation that can be had, not just with the promoters, but with their partners and because ultimately the FIA is a charitable organization.
Yep.
And it has a foundation. There is a independent foundation in London, the FIA Foundation, which is specifically a charity under the UK Charities Act. And the opportunity that exists, in my mind, is if we as an FIA can be a good partner and we can help them grow, then the flip side of this is that we can also articulate, well, here's why it is good for your sponsors to help us with projects in Asia and in Latin America and in Africa. And this is how we can make it tax efficient, and this is how, all those kinds of conversations.
Right.
And if you look at big championships, particularly ones in the US with which I'm familiar, the NFL, let's take that as a for instance.
Yep.
Their Play 60 initiative, their flag football, and all the way down to Pee Wee football. They are involved in that, and they are doing that because they ultimately see the value for them in terms of fans, in terms of fan engagement, in terms of engaging younger people and talking to a new audience and so on and so forth. They've gone to new markets they play in the UK now every year. They play in Germany now. They play in, played in Brazil, because they're engaging new markets, and they're taking their sponsors, they're explaining to them why this is good for them. And that's what we need to do. Is rather than being confrontational and trying to renegotiate because we're throwing out, all kinds of ideas over time, we can go in and say, look, here's what the benefit to you is. Mm-hmm. The benefit of having strong karting is that you will then have strong Formula 4, strong Formula 3, strong Formula 2, and ultimately strong Formula 1. The benefit of cross car for, people, for instance, if we can get that to grow and thrive, is ultimately that leads to rally and rally cross.
Right.
It is a off-road endeavor that can absolutely be set up, in any country anywhere for at the moment, relatively low cost. And if we can work on that and do better, we can make it lower cost. And provide promoters and in local regions and the ASNs, the sport clubs in local regions with a template with which they can go out and do this. This is how we grow revenue in the FIA, because otherwise our revenue is fixed.
Yep.
As you say, those deals have been done.
Yep.
Now, Mohammed has raised license fees on drivers. The Formula One drivers, even the Formula One drivers who are making millions are beginning to say, whoa.
Yeah, they're squealing a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we've reached a limit there. The racetracks that Formula One races on have seen hundreds % increases in their license fees.
Wow.
I think we've reached a limit there. All of the circuits around the world, whether you're a grade, so grade 1 is Formula 1, grade 2 is just, roughly speaking, and it's a power to weight ratio formula, but basically you're talking about, circuits that can take touring car and that kind of thing.
Right.
IndyCar races at grade 2 circuits. Those fees have gone up. Grade 3 has gone up.
Wow.
Every category has gone up. Okay, we've reached the limit on those fees.
Yeah.
And again, from my view, the new way for us to increase revenue is to stop being oppositional to our stakeholders, the people that are investing in the sport, and start engaging them in a way that encourages investment.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, Mohammed said he kind of made a meal out of the fact that, hey, I brought in an 11th team and brought Cadillac in and the entry fee. And I'm sure that entry fee is a welcome friend, but, that doesn't seem like a long-term plan for me. Now we're going to do a 12th team. Well, okay, but that's a limited, there's diminished returns on this because the existing teams don't want to split the prize money 20 different ways with 20 different teams. And there's a capacity load here that starts to become untenable. So while I welcome an 11th team or possibly a 12th team, that can't be your sole focus on real revenue generation. It's got to be in other areas. And I think your comment, which really is salient to the point, is that Formula One has the viewerships, has the broadcast revenue, has all of the revenue they're generating through content and digital content creation. It's all wonderful for them based, on the back of DTS. When you look at the teams, this is sort of the rising tide theory, right? The teams are doing well. They have their own programs where they're harvesting and developing drivers.
Hold on. Before you get too far on the teams are doing well, the teams are doing better.
Yeah.
Than they were. But for many of them, they have not reached the break-even point from where they started their investment. So,
right.
You have certainly the revenue has gotten to a point where they are now profitable. More or less, because even though the cost cap is let's just call it $145 million.
Right.
Which sounds like an unbelievable amount of money, but in the context of a 24 race championship and everything that goes into it, it's a constraint.
Yeah.
But that's what has allowed that people to invest in these smaller teams and to put the money in, but they had to put a lot of money in to get them to the level that they are now.
Yeah.
And I don't think that return on investment to where you can say, okay, we're now, rolling around in bathtubs of money is genuine. And, not so long ago, Mohammed said, it's very difficult for us as the FIA to enforce the cost cap. So maybe we shouldn't have a cost cap. Well, again, that's not the spirit. Now, if he had said, look, it's very difficult, we need more money to do it, I get it. Yeah. And I think that's what he ultimately meant, but it's not what he said. So,
right.
These are disincentives to investment, which is critical. And, as I say, these teams are now profitable on a year-over-year basis, but have not necessarily reached a point where they're generating net revenue for their investors.
Yeah, it's a really good point because, as fans, and you look at like Dorilton Capital and their investment in Williams, if Williams and James and team, some wonderful people over there, if they've got the team in the black, let's say, it's probably not in rude financial health, but they're methodically moving. Or I think of Gene Haas, who I'm sure you know well. In Gene's case, he's run at a negative for quite a while building this team. And while Formula One is super popular and generating revenue, and the prize money may go up, it's a great reminder, Tim, that the ROI for some of these investors probably isn't really materialized at this point.
Well, and what's really important is we could focus forever on Formula One.
Yep.
But the FIA is not, the president of the FIA is not the president of Formula One. He's not the president of, let's say, just WEC. We're talking about teams in all of the championships, and not just in FIA championships, but we're also talking about teams and investors and people who are putting their money in, in regional championships, and we need to be laser focused in taking down barriers which add cost, add complexity, that might be, a barrier based on culture. That's the job of the FIA. And this sort of, and not all of that costs a lot of money to do.
Right. Tim, something just popped in my head. You had talked about, lowering the cost of entry and barriers and material constraints that might happen at a regional, small, emerging market. Does the FIA, or is there room in the P&L to help with sort of global circuit development, whether you're partnering with governments or private investors to build a more affordable FIA certified? These aren't grade ones, but more FIA certified circuits in these emerging regions, so that these clubs or these areas can generate some sanctioning fees for hosting or some club revenue to help grow those clubs? There's some research that needs to be done. It's not. I guarantee you, as somebody who has helped build circuits, helped design circuits, helped with all of this, that there are things that can be done that are going to make it, much more affordable. Yeah.
And it's to provide templates that don't require, an expensive designer to go out and research it and do it for you. And look, I've worked with Tilka, I've worked with, Apex Circuit Design, I've worked with, many, many others, and, they do amazing work.
Yeah.
And in some ways they're doing the work for the FIA, and these circuits that have been developed, the investors there are spending, enormous amounts of money to build these circuits. An asphalt-based circuit now is a very expensive thing. For those of us in the United States, we think of some of the great circuits like Elkhart Lake.
Love it.
Or Mid Ohio, for instance. These were, and maybe it's oversimplifying it, but these were individuals who went out with a D1 Caterpillar, and decided, okay, I'm going to take my bulldozer this way, and I'm going to develop a great circuit. Yeah. Developing, and they've done it, and those circuits have improved over time. They've put a huge amount of investment to improve over time. Yeah. But there are things that you can do, when you are just work with space, that you are, and you're not so constrained about trying to create a spectator circuit, a circuit where you've got spectators close to the circuit. And maybe I'm getting into the weeds here, but long story short, there are things you can do to develop a simpler regulation that somebody with a Google Earth map and and some goodwill can develop.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I live here, at the foothills in the Ozark Mountains, and they built a track down here in the Ozarks, and it's over these rolling hills in the middle of the Ozark, woods, and it's a very interesting track. But it'd been great if they could engage the FIA, have that FIA certification at some level, and those kind of things would be interesting. I want to tack in the wind here a little bit and move to improving governance. I think this is a big issue for even fans sitting at home watching sport, whether, like you said, whether it's WEC or F1 or WRC. How do you see the FIA improving its transparency and accountability?
Well, first of all, you have to have a determination that that's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. I think that there are probably two areas you're talking about. One is on the officiating side. And I think that the way that the FIA officiates is opaque to most people. Mm-hmm. I've been a race director. I've been a steward in almost every championship that the FIA has at one point or another. It's sort of not that complicated, but somehow we managed to not articulate it that well.
Yeah.
There are an enormous number of people who work really hard as volunteers to be stewards, and the Formula One stewards, of which I was a Formula One steward for 15 years, do it for free. And to get to that point, you have to have had a career somewhere, some experience that helps drive you there. The FIA has recently introduced what they call the HPP program. And this is a way of trying to accelerate people coming into the top level championships. Mm-hmm. I think the way they're doing it is naive. To be a top level, championship official, you need 5, 10, 15 years worth of experience. Right. And to think that you can do a weekend course and then send some people off for observation and then go from there and call that good is just, it's naive. It's a misunderstanding of what it takes to be a steward in the room at the time.
Right.
I think the FIA can present stewarding in a less opaque way, can present officiating in a less opaque way. I mean, if you're watching an NFL game, you watch it live. You watch them steward live, and the zebras on the field. It's either this or it's no call. So we can do a better job of that. I do actually think the individual stewards do a remarkable job. Again, I don't know that people understand the resources that certainly Formula One stewards have. And I would increasingly at the World Endurance Championship level and at many of the other levels, there's some great technology that has been brought in to help the stewards. but again, it's more this explanation of what's going on and why is this consistent with this.
Right.
That's something that we ought to be able to articulate and not stand back sort of Buddha-like and say, well, we're the regulator, so it's good.
Yeah,
I actually welcome this release recently of the guidelines that the FIA did. I think that's probably helpful to people to realize that the stewards, this was an initiative of the stewards, and I was one of them. And look, I want to say success has 1,000 feathers. There were at least 10 of us in the room when we did that. We sat down and we said, okay, for the sake of consistency, let's write down all of the things that we officiate on, particularly in the racing, and write down what a standard penalty is for it, and then talk about deviating from one to another, et cetera, et cetera. And that conversation was had with the drivers. That conversation, in particular, was had with the team managers, and that has been iterated over time as we found. Maybe this was wrong. Maybe this was. For instance, the stewards, on their own initiative, sat down with the Formula One drivers and said, "Are the penalties right for this?" And the drivers came out and said, for some of this stuff, it shouldn't be a 5-second penalty. It should be a 10-second penalty. Oh, okay. So we made that adjustment on all the stuff we agreed on. And then, of course, we all got criticized for being inconsistent with previous decisions because you've gone from 5 to 10, and how's that possible?
Right.
But, there is a process that we should be able to articulate, and we should be able to explain it. And, I think we don't do a good job of that. We sort of make it seem like everything gets fed into a black box and that people aren't, working with goodwill towards that. And by the way, this is no different than governance and, when it comes to financials and so on and so forth. It should not be a black box. It should be, the Senate should have the full authority to go in and do financial oversight. And when they see a problem and they call one out, that I don't actually see the Senate doing their job as a problem. If I'm president and these Senate members who, to take an example, Tom Purvis, was an incredibly accomplished man who was pushed out, who basically because he said, "Hey, we've got a problem." And to me, that's like, okay, the Senate is like a board of directors. It's there to help guide, or it should be anyway. To help guide the president. And I'm going to consult with them and say, "Hey, tell me how I can do this better. Explain to me why this is a problem, and let's fix it." This is normal governance of companies. It's normal governance, in government, in proper, in democratic institutions. The Senate and the House in the U.S. get to ask questions of the executive.
Right.
That's the way it should work.
Right.
In the UK, the Parliament, they have committees that ask questions of the Prime Minister and his administration, and all around the world. I'm not going to, I am most familiar with the English-speaking world, but all around the world there are these normal, processes, that exist.
Yeah, and I would think, when you're governing like that, in my mind, publish a quarterly sort of financial and governance report detailing the revenue allocation, decision-making process, what decisions were made. I mean, this should be all open. There shouldn't be anything nefarious in this, just to build that trust among stakeholders, clubs, and those kind of things. That happens certainly for not-for-profits here in the States. One of the things on the F1 story, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this because I know all of our listeners will kill me if I don't. The question on F1 stewarding in particular, and we get this all the time, is it possible to have a standardized stewarding crew for all races? I know I know, or correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, I've read Max Moses' autobiography, so I saw how some of these rules and regulations were purposely left vague so you could really work within the margins on context. But it's my understanding that one of the perks of the member clubs is to be race stewards for races in their host nations, etc. I assume they still do that. Mm-hmm. Fans are like on the edge of their patience with the lack of consistency. Is it possible to have an official stewarding crew? Is there room in the P&L for it? Is the perks too strong for member clubs to avoid doing that? And if you can't do that, how can we solve that issue?
Well, I'm gently going to push back.
Okay.
Michael Massey, who
Yep.
controversial race director, but I've known him for many years and has worked incredibly hard at his craft. He actually did a survey with the drivers and said he set up all the decisions and asked them, what would your decision be? And it was like 95% of the decisions, the majority of drivers agreed with the stewards on those decisions.
Oh, interesting.
So and when you look at the number of decisions that FIA stewards take versus the ones that you really hear about, most of them are incredibly uncontroversial.
Right.
Now, if there's one or two clashes a race where people have an opinion.
Yeah, of course.
I would tell you that the Formula One stewards have an incredible amount of information to refer to. Typically on any given incident, it's multiple angles of video, it's telemetry, it's radio, it's many other things. And so they have sort of a privileged view of what's happened. It would be incredibly boring to try and show that process to the fans. It would take... the stewards typically are very busy in a Formula One race. As I say, most of the decisions go unnoticed because they're uncontroversial. The ones that are noticed, here's where I guess I'll push back. We all of us have a view of certain types of incident and certain types of driving style. Mm-hmm. And I'll certainly take the most controversial driver out there, probably Max.
Yep.
And Max has a certain driving style. And by the way, his job as a race car driver is to drive that car as close to the edge for as much time as is absolutely possible. And he's clearly one of the more successful drivers in history at doing that. So is it inevitable that at some point he's going to drive it over that edge when he consistently keeps it on that edge?
Right.
For sure. Your definition of what the edge between one person and another might vary. And as many meetings, and believe me, there are hundreds of hours of meetings on this topic amongst the stewards. As many meetings as you can have, one person is going to have a slightly different view of it to another. And that will advantage or disadvantage a particular driver depending on who your quote-unquote permanent set of stewards is.
Right.
So while I accept that having a permanent set of stewards would give you at least a more permanent definition of what is and isn't acceptable, it may or may not advantage or disadvantage one driver's driving style or one sort of set of situation or another. And the FIA has had a permanent steward in the past and has always come back around and rejected it in the end for this very reason, because they felt like, investing that much power in one person doesn't work for the teams. So, I'm not against having that discussion, sitting down with the drivers and the teams and saying, okay, but I would definitely be the person saying, be careful what you wish for, because you might actually get it.
Point. It's a really good point, Tim. I'm not picking on anyone in particular. I'm just running it through my mind as you're explaining that. Two things that come to mind. One, I always like to try to look at the flip side of my argument and counter it. And I would think that one thing I have noticed is a reduction in teams sort of appealing a lot of decisions versus maybe 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. The appeal rate seems to be low, in my opinion, which is probably good. The other thing is you're mentioning the permanent steward. I'm just running through my mind. I think I'm not picking on like Damon Hill, a wonderful guy. We share a birthday. Love Damon. But Damon, not a big fan of Max's driving style. If he was the permanent race steward, you could always see a higher level of scrutiny over one particular driver who that steward may or may not agree with the driving style, whereas rotating the board a little bit, you're going to get a wider range of view of racing. And so I can see your point there. I hope I'm paraphrasing that.
No, I mean, that's accurate. And, I mean, certainly not to pick on Damon, but all of the driver stewards have a huge voice in how this is. After 34 years of professional motorsport, I can watch an incident and typically come up with an answer that I am absolutely satisfied with, and most people would be. Right. But a driver steward like Derek Warwick can just get there quicker. Yeah. Because he's lived it. Even watching it on a monitor, he feels it in the seat of his pants. Yeah. I would, Tonio Luizzi is one of the driver stewards, and I've worked with Tonio, and I've literally watched him, go, okay, guys, this is how this happened, and it's like, and because he's now in his private life, he mentors and teaches a number of drivers. He's an incredibly successsul restaurateur in Milan, in case anybody ever wants to go visit one of his restaurants. They're great. But his ability to explain in the room, okay, this is what happened, and you kind of go, wow, just how did he get there that quick? But every one of them has a driving style. They all have a driving style. So, I've heard the suggestion that maybe we should have more drivers as stewards. Mm-hmm. I think one in the room works really well. I've seen it with two in the room, and as when I'm chairman of the stewards, and I can tell you, it was, I won't say it was a nightmare, but it was, I had to kind of like, okay, guys, we need to like come to an agreement on this. Right. And that's why I think I say with some authority that it's not always good to have one perspective. You're gonna something's, and it's I mentioned British driver stewards. It's not it's not because they're British. Because whether they're Italian or German or whatever they might be. We've had some amazingly good driver stewards over the time. It's just because this is a multivariable equation. Every corner is a multivariable equation, and not everybody solves it the same way. Right. And so you get slight variation, and that's. But I would argue that you're talking about there being less appeals. Although most of the decisions that have for penalties are not appealable. But generally speaking, I think it's because the work of the stewards, and I've been privileged to be part of that committees and so on that have helped evolve this. It's no longer, even the national stewards, you talk about national stewards on the panel, all of these people are quasi-professional at what they do. They have spent the 10,000 hours, and in some cases hundreds of thousands of hours to get to where they are. Right. That's great. I was thinking about and we've covered this, so I won't dive back into it, but I do like your commentary on, in my notes, I have this sort of long-term rules.
And there was always that element. The longer the regulations are stable, the closer the competitiveness of the teams. And the fans are all excited because one of 5 different drivers can win a race. And then the criticism fan is always like, okay, well, then we change the regulation. This could apply to WEC or other series too. But, and then we change the regulations, and the teams spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on new regulations and new cars and new aero and new chassis, and and we evolved that. I believe I read, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but I believe you alluded to it earlier that it is important to have long-term regulatory frameworks that manufacturers can bank on, that sponsors can bank on, that teams can bank on and monetize and budget for in the long term in development and R&D. And I'm thinking that you were a big proponent of that. Is that correct?
Yes, but and the but is that if you are talking about Formula One, you have to be talking about a formula that represents the leading edge of technology that is, in my opinion, needs to be applicable to the road 5 years, 10 years down the road. So you can't just say we're going to freeze the formula for 10 years.
Right.
In Formula One, because it's contrary to what the formula is about. And you can talk about what is the right period of stability in each championship based on what that formula, what that championship is about. So, for instance, Formula E has had multiple generations of their car. They haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater every time they've done it. There's not a complete revolution of the formula, but they have incrementally improved it as battery technology has improved and so on and so forth. So the reasons they have changed the cars is to better represent the relevance that they have to electric mobility and that connection. So, it is always a value proposition that has to happen. What is the value of changing the formula versus the value of keeping it the same,
right,
or similar? And what is that pathway? What are we going to? What are the incremental steps we're going to take towards the future? So, I'm very much for a long-term pathway, but that doesn't mean I'm against change.
Yeah, you're always going to have that migration path with technology, that's always going to force that to drive forward, and manufacturers are going to want that too. And then my final question, completely off the wall, but I'd love to get your opinion. How do you think WC is doing with their balancer performance, BOP? Do you think it's a good job?
Wow.
I know. That's a gotcha question. Sorry about that. But BOP is huge. But
Why don't we add driver ratings into that as well, just so that we're fully into the...
We're committed to...
Listen, I actually will address driver ratings. I think when you look... Because I actually think driver ratings are a great way to segue into BOP. Why do we have driver ratings? And I was involved in sort of part of the creation of this formula. Again,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, this has 1,000 fathers, but and I'm but one of them. When I was at IMSA, I was chief operating officer of IMSA. We got a lot of complaints from gentlemen drivers who were funding teams saying, hey, I've spent all this money to do this, and I was going to be the second stint driver, and my guy got forced out, or my team said, okay, if we're going to win, you're only going to drive 15 minutes out of the 2 hours 45 of what used to be an American Le Mans Series race, or this, that, and the other thing. And they're like, hey, help us. We're the ones investing the money. We need help. That's the genesis of the driver rating system and the time allocations for drivers. There are always going to be cases on the margin where you could argue that a silver should be a gold, or a gold should be a silver, or whatever it might be. But I think the statistic now is that there are over 9,000 rated drivers around the world. And the committee that does this, I know every one of them, and I'm not going to name any of them because they get hate mail when their names are used. But of those 9,000, I would argue that 98, 99% of them are accurately placed. The different championships are allowed to use those ratings however they want, so that's appropriate. So SRO uses it differently for their championships than, say, it's used in the WeatherTech Championship or the WEC or pick a championship, 24 hours of Spa and Nürburgring. Though all of those they have the option of using it however they want. So, is it fundamentally unfair? Absolutely not. Are some instances of unfairness going to exist? Yes. And I would say the same thing about BOP. BOP came about because if you don't have it, then let's just say you're trying to develop I'm going to say car X versus car Y.
Yep.
And the car X is a larger passenger car than car Y, meaning larger glass house, and so aerodynamics are different, and you're trying to do this, that, and the other thing. So if you try and force those two cars, at some point somebody's going to say, you know what, the regulations don't work for me, I'm out of here. So if we want the participation of manufacturers, we've got to somehow limit, and instead of telling them you've only got X amount of money, we say you can spend whatever you like, but we're going to adjust it. So that's the other way of disincentivizing overspending on things that don't matter to the racing.
Right.
And over the years in sports car racing, we have seen this boom-bust cycle. Can-Am is probably the most famous example of that, where you had, my dad was there when McLaren was, it was only one car could win. It was the orange car of McLaren. And then we had the era of the Porsches. And after that, Can-Am was gone, right? So, that's an example of a sports car championship where it went up, great, it went down.
Yeah.
BOP is a way of making sure that that manufacturers, everybody has a way to approach it without spending just unlimited amounts of money, and which does give everybody a chance. Right. Is it going to be perfect? On the margins, no. And unfortunately, BOP is all about marginal differences.
Right.
So, finding the perfect BOP is beyond difficult. It's an incredibly difficult endeavor.
But they've gotten a lot more sophisticated, right, with torque censoring now, and it's not just trying to mitigate airflow or overall, BHP.
Yeah. It's not just adding success ballast, as it were, which is the old way of doing it. So, it sounds like I'm making excuses for BOP, and I kind of am. But what we're seeing now tells us that it generally works.
Yeah.
The number of manufacturers that have come in, my experience as an official is that the pressuring the officials in football, I think they call positioning the refs.
Yeah.
You watch the coach on the sideline, whispering in the side judge's ear. Well, this is kind of the same thing that's happening. I mean, and I don't blame the teams. They are more than well aware of how this all happens. They participate in the process. Yeah. But, particularly at IMSA, there is a manufacturers' council where they all swap data and they all have an opportunity to have an input. Sometimes it works for a particular track and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, just let's call a spade a spade. But the racing has, typically been incredibly close when you look at historically what has racing been. You come down to the last lap on almost every race, including 24-hour races. I mean, that used to be unheard of.
Exactly.
I mean, by 4 in the morning at Daytona, it used to be, everybody, you could start drinking the champagne then because people knew who was going to win, plus or minus a breakdown or something like that.
Yeah.
Now it's down to the last 30 minutes has been a dogfight. I was at Le Mans this year. Certainly the Ferraris won, but there was going into the last hour, there were multiple other cars that could have done it as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It would be disingenuous to say that we can't do better because we always can do that, and that has got to be the standard by which the sanctioning bodies in the case of IMSA or the world governing body, we have to always not rest on our laurels, say, what can we do better? How can we do it better? Again, get in the room, have a consultation, everybody gets to have their input, and then at some point somebody has to make a decision. But
it's a much more measured decision. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's such a great point because now, I watch 24-hour races and you got 18, 19 cars in hypercar on the lead lap and the winner won by 4.2 seconds or 2.1 seconds, the racing has been incredible. And so much so now that anyone that watches WEC or Le Mans or IMSA on these endurance races, they'll say it's an absolute sprint for 24 hours. There's no lift and coast here.
I just came back from Brazil yesterday, from the race in Sao Paulo, and up and down the paddock. As much as certainly there's discussion about BOP and what can we do better and so on and so forth, everybody is also saying this is just a sprint race. It's a 6-hour sprint race.
Yep.
And nobody really knows going into it who can win. I mean, you've got Cadillac on the pole, and then that mix of different people that are having an opportunity to celebrate their participation in the sport is just absolutely remarkable and is unprecedented in the history of the sport. So BOP is not perfect. I am an armchair racer just as much as everybody else.
Yep.
And so, I'm willing to talk about what could be done differently, but at the same time, it's kind of working.
Yeah, it is. It really is. That's awesome. Tim, before I let you go, I want to at least open the floor for any other elements of your platform that I haven't touched on or we haven't touched on that you'd like to make sure that everyone knows about your quest to what I would call reinvigorate and restore the respect to the FIA. Is there anything that I haven't touched on that this has been a great conversation, and thank you so much, Todd, for inviting me. I think the message that I'm taking to the member clubs who vote is that you can have, on the one hand, an FIA that recognizes the issues of the member clubs, that is driving value to those member clubs, whether it be on the mobility or on the sports side. And to me, mobility in some ways is where the FIA could establish a new legacy that really we haven't up until this point. We've not really, that has not been our main focus. And I think just the opportunity for human dignity and access to transportation and so on is just huge. But we can provide those things. We can help these clubs with their businesses on the one hand. And on the other hand, we can have a federation that they can be proud of, a federation that's respected, a federation that's trusted, and one that is a good partner to our partners. And I use that word deliberately, our partners in Formula One, in all of the major championships, and can be a partner with and bring those partnerships from major championships to the clubs and develop a win-win-win strategy. This is possible for our member clubs.
It takes professional management. It takes honesty, openness, integrity. But those things are possible, and that's my commitment to the clubs. That's what I'm going to deliver. I'm going to work really hard over the next 5 months to go around and talk to as many of those clubs as possible and explain that to them.
Oh, excellent. Tim, you are a singular professional, and I am so grateful for your generous time and kind consideration of coming on and talking to us. And we absolutely wish you all the best in the election, and thank you so much for taking time to speak with us.
Todd, thank you so much.
It's not what I feel I've got to prove at all. I don't really want to prove anything. I started as an amateur with no idea or no intention of becoming world champion. I was curious to find out